to the second day of our Risk and Regulation Summit. I'm Holly Ty, Specification Editor at Assemble Media Group, and our focus for this session is demystifying the specification requirements of building safety reform. The post-Grenfell pursuit of building safety improvements has laid out some of the biggest regulatory changes the sector has ever had to tackle. And while data sharing, cultural reform and competence requirements are among the challenges, the significance of the product, manufacturing and specification changes needed cannot be understated. This morning, we're going to hear from a panel of experts as they unpack the new requirements from a product perspective. We'll be discussing the new requirements for manufacturers when attaining and supplying specifications, the changed obligations for the design team, and the onus that falls on construction firms when it comes to installation and record keeping. We'll also touch the ramifications of non-compliance as we explore what the changes mean for insurance and liability. Our panel today, who I'm very excited to introduce, includes Adam Eaton, Director of Fire Safety at Hydrock, Andrew Meller, Partner at PRP, and Hannah Clark, who will hopefully be joining us in a few moments, who's the Digital and Policy Manager at Construction Products Association. For those of you tuning in, please do submit your questions throughout. Once we've heard from all our speakers today, there will be time for a Q&A at the end. And I just want to flag that as with all our sessions, this webinar will be available free on demand for 12 months via the same link that you joined by today. So if you want to rewatch or share with someone else, then you can. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our first speaker. Adam, over to you.
Hi there, everyone. Good morning. As Holly says, I'm Adam Eaton, Director of Fire Safety at Hydrock. I'm just going to put some slides on screen now, and I'll briefly talk you through just kind of an overview of the Act, really, without going into too many specifics. And then some of the speakers following me will probably go into some more specifics there, and we can pick the rest of the queries up as the debate goes on. So just starting, what does the Act apply to? So the Building Safety Act itself does not apply to all residential buildings, or all buildings, sorry. It only applies to residential buildings containing 2 or more dwellings, and that's buildings that are above 18 metres in height or more than 6 stories above ground level. And it includes secure residential institutions and temporary accommodation, such as hotels. But that's the Act itself, but the Building Safety Regulator and the Products Regulator will have oversight of all things within construction, and rather than just those higher risk buildings. So I've got this slide here, and I like this slide because it shows kind of the transition of what's happened in kind of guidance changes, regulation changes, updates, policy changes, government advice notes. And as you can see from back in 2017, when the Grenfell Tower fire was, there's been a lot of change in the industry. Now, a lot of change that was needed, and there's positive change within there. But the warning signs were there previously. As you can see, back in 2009, there was the Lakenal House fire, and the coroner's recommendations and outcome following that fire were quite damning, and made a number of recommendations which weren't implemented. We've gone through all these changes, advice notes, guidance changes, which took us to April last year, when the Building Safety Act was published and received royal assent. And now we're in that transitionary period where we're waiting for the secondary legislation to come into play. Throughout all of this, Dame Judith Hackett was instrumental in conducting her view into the regulatory regime. And what she found was quite damning, really. She found that the current system of building regulations and fire safety is not fit for purpose. There's a note that culture change is needed and required for buildings to make sure they're safe now and in the future. But one of the big points in there as well was around competency, and making sure people that are doing their roles are competent to do so. And within the Act itself, there's going to be a lot of different duty holders now, and each of these people will be required to be competent. Now, in terms of fire safety specifically, the competency requirements, it is that there should be suitably qualified engineer with relevant experience in fire safety, such as a chartered engineer registered with the Engineering Council by the Institution of Fire Engineers, or suitably qualified and competent professional with demonstrable experience to address the complexity of the design being proposed in terms of fire safety. Now, that's quite wordy, but it's all around someone being qualified for the job, not just on qualifications on paper, but making sure they've got the experience as well within the built environment to know what they're actually advising on. Now, as well as competency, there's a capacity problem within the industry. So there's approximately only 300 chartered fire engineers or chartered engineers registered through the Institution of Fire Engineers at the moment. And there was a building safety bill impact assessment estimating that we require an increase of about 50% in fire engineering capacity to meet the requirements of the Act. And now the role of a fire engineer is also changing. So previously, the role of a fire engineer was almost a small or minor part, or viewed as so, of the design and construction team. They would outline the strategy, and then it would be the responsibility of others to ensure they complied with the strategy that was set out by the fire engineer. Now, more and more now, as we'll see with things like fire statements for planning at Gateway 1, EWS1 forms and FRAWs for external walls, you're needing in most cases now a chartered fire engineer to sign these elements off. And also now throughout construction, fire engineers are being asked to check others' designs and others' specifications more regularly and doing quite in-depth checks of these things. So the role of the fire engineer has changed, and the amount of fire engineers or qualified fire engineers within the industry has not increased massively. So there is going to be that transitional period where we are trying to upskill more people within the industry to meet all the requirements of the Building Safety Act. And the final slide for me is just touching on the gateways. So Gateway 1 that you can see there doesn't quite sit within the Building Safety Act. That's already been enacted and that's already in play. So it sits outside of the Act itself. But Gateway 1 is around making sure you've had a fire engineer on board from the early stages of planning, making sure they've considered the site constraints and the plans within the boundaries, and making sure that adequate provisions can be put in place for fire safety. What we're waiting for now is the secondary legislation, which is expected before October later this year, which was kind of the 18-month transitional period following royal assent of the Act in April last year. And Gateway 2 is before construction commence. So once you've got Gateway 1 at planning, you then have permission to go and design that building. Once you've designed it and submitted your plans to the building safety regulator, you will get a stop-go point at Gateway 2 before you can commence construction. And the building safety regulator has the power to stop you proceeding to construction. Then you'll go into the gateway, well, you'll go into construction, and at the end of construction will be Gateway 3, and that's before occupation. At that point, you'll need to demonstrate that you built what you designed and that you've recorded all the information throughout the process. Any change control and things like that is all documented, so you're maintaining that digital golden thread of information.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was a really nice introduction. We're still waiting on Hannah, so I think I'm going to pass over to Andrew, who's going to be our next speaker.
Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Andrew.
So I'm just going to bring my slides up, everybody. So good morning. I'm Andrew Mallow at PRP, and I'm going to talk to you about one of the specific duty holders that Adam stated in his presentation there. I'm going to talk about the principal designer for building regulations, and this role shouldn't be confused with the principal designer for CDM regulations that you know of now, but we will be brought in through the CDM regulations, but they are two completely separate roles. And I've titled this Specifying the Risk because I think the principal designer role brings a lot of risk. Firstly, starting with the fact that we don't know exactly what this role will be yet. So the government published the duty holder regulations back in draft form in July 2022, but then promptly removed them, pulled them. Must be having some changes being made to them, and we're expecting those, we assume, in April or May of this year. So what I'm going to show you yet is what we think the role is going to be, with some intelligence behind that, but it could be up for change. So when is this role required? Well, it's required on all projects where a building regulations application is needed. So if you're doing a house extension at home, you're going to need a principal designer with for building regulations compliance purposes, and also required on any project up to the most complex project we have in this country where a building regulations application is needed. There will be enhanced duties for the principal designer for building regulations on relevant buildings under the Building Safety Act, and Adam's just taking you through what those relevant buildings are. So I do wonder whether we are going to have two different levels of principal designer for building regulations compliance here. We're going to have one on the more simpler projects because different level of expertise is required, different levels of risk are placed on the individual or the company by that role, compared to the one that's required under the Building Safety Act, where there will be more duties that the principal designer for building regs has to comply with. So the principal designer must absolutely legally be required to be appointed before the building control approval application for high-risk buildings under the Building Safety Act. That's Gateway 2, as Adam just discussed, or on start on site for all other projects. But in actual fact, their duties require them to ensure that the design complies with the building regulations to the best of all intents and purposes. And therefore, they've got to be appointed long before that Gateway 2 or the start on site. The anticipated requirement is from October this year, and we know that HSE is stating on their website that Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 will be introduced in October this year. So we can bet that we're going to need a hell of a lot of principal designers before October, and long before in advance of October, if they've got to be appointed and checking that the design complies with the building regulations before that initial Gateway 2 application is submitted. So there's a lot to do. So what are the principal designer duties? The role for the principal designer in building regulations terms is to plan, manage, coordinate, and monitor the design work. The principal designer controls the design work to ensure compliance with the building regulations. So as I see it, it's effectively a lead consultant role, but formally related to building regulations. And it's believed on many projects that that will be the architect leading this, because often they are lead designer, particularly where there's a major component of architectural design. But if it was a civils project or an M&E project, there may be other disciplines that undertake this role. So another duty is to ensure that all designers cooperate and communicate their work to the client, the principal contractor, and other designers. And that principal contractor is another duty holder, as is the client. The principal contractor here is also one that relates to building regulations. So the principal designer ensures that the design complies with the building regulation. The principal contractor ensures that the construction complies with the building regulations. So the principal designer must appraise and challenge the design to aid compliance. Effectively, it's an interactive role during the design process. It's not box ticking to complete a form. So does the principal designer have a level of responsibility to check the specification of systems and products? Let's take cavity barriers or another item that relates to fire safety. Are we checking that they are compliant products? I don't think so. I think that's unlikely for the principal designer. But what the principal designer will have to have is very good knowledge about the functional requirements of all building regulations, not just the fire safety regulations, and an understanding of what the requirements are of the approved documents, so that they can challenge the design team and say, have we produced a design which demonstrates compliance with these functional parts of the building regulations? I don't think they'll be going down to the degree of checking products. I think that will be down to the other designers on the team. So what are the required competency requirements for the principal designer? Well, the answer is we don't quite know yet, like much of this that I'm presenting. But the principal designer is a designer and may have to undertake site inspections. So why might they have to undertake site inspections? Well, I always thought that might be related to the fact that they need to say that the design has been executed as per the design proposals when it's being constructed on site, to ensure it complies with the building regulations. Because under the Building Safety Act for HRBs, high risk buildings, at Gateway 3, they will have to sign a declaration to say that they discharge their duties in relation to the principal designer, which is one of the duties is ensuring compliance with the building regulations. So I can't see that not being done without site inspections, or at least a relationship with someone who's undertaking the site inspections. But there's also something called mandatory reporting within the Building Safety Act, and this is effectively whistleblowing. So the principal designer has a role to ensure that the design is being executed, and if it's not, that any risks are formally reported through a mechanism that's created by the client, the principal designer and principal contractor, through to the building safety regulator. So it may be that the principal designer is going on site to undertake inspections in relation to those risks. So we have someone who's a designer, probably a project manager, because they've got to coordinate things during the design process, and they have the ability to undertake site inspections. So to me, this is always deemed to be, or seen to be, not an individual. This possibly as a team, particularly on these more complex high-risk buildings. So we now, from the British standards, have a new publicly accessible specification 8671, which is the competency framework for principal designers. It is very high level, it is very strategic, gives some understanding of what the competency requirements are, but it doesn't make you a principal designer for building regulations. So there's bound to be some third-party training and certification required. Third-party training so if I wanted to be a principal designer, I can demonstrate to the industry, and particularly to my clients, because they have a formal requirement on these more complex buildings to check the principal designer competency and submit that at Gateway 2 application, building control approval application to the building safety regulator. So they'll want to see my name, they'll want to see it's on a national register or an industry register that I'm a qualified principal designer. But in my mind, undertaking the training will only give me basic knowledge. I'll need a greater level of expertise and experience to undertake that role. So it's not for someone who's very junior, new into the industry. They're going to need to be able to manage meetings. They're going to need to be able to manage a design team. They're potentially going to need the competency to go on site and undertake relevant inspections. So we're looking at key individuals, and I don't see this either as a principal designer from a CDM perspective, a health and safety role. That might be part of the component, but they're going to have some design knowledge and also a very good knowledge of the building regulations, as I said earlier. So what else required for this role? Well, if I'm going to start undertaking it in my business, I'm obviously going to need appointment documents that include specific terms and conditions related to this new role. And as yet, we don't understand it, so possibly we can't start producing these. My professional indemnity insurers are going to absolutely want to know what is the role and how I'm protecting the company when we undertake this role, and what are the risks associated with this role. You know, signing off that declaration at the end of Gateway 3 on the high risk buildings obviously comes with some level of risk, and we get to really understand what the insurers will say about that. I can't just start this process without having internal processes and procedures in place either. I'm going to need report templates. I'm going to need reporting templates. Sorry, I'm going to need meeting minutes. I need to record the process as well. So I'm going to need standard templates that I use across projects. I'm going to need a quality assurance system, because through our QA system, we're going to need to know that we're actually checking the process, and we've got people with the expertise in the business to actually check what we're issuing as well and what we're undertaking. And as I said, I think this is a team, maybe on the smaller projects, on your typical house extension, single house. This could well be the architect or the designer undertaking this on their own. But if I'm to coordinate the structural design and the M&E design, then it's going to need more expertise in the business, or it's going to need partnerships with other consultancies to bring that expertise into my business so that we can provide this role. So it will be a team, I believe, that will be undertaking this, led by an individual. And on the work that I did previously for government with my team, looking at how this role might be undertaken and the wider Building Safety Act work, we determined that possibly a team from a principal designer's perspective could manage 5 projects, 5 large Building Safety Act size projects. And that gives you an indication about how many principal designers and principal designer teams may be required. So we've also got to find these other disciplines. So if I want to have a relationship as an architectural practice with a structural engineering and M&E practice, we've got to find them. We've got to find that they've got the appetite to undertake this role, they've got the expertise, and they've got the back-to-back PI insurance with what we have as an organisation and we'll be offering our clients. So as it seems, all of this has to be in place before October. And I think that's a really tall order, considering nothing's published on the role formally yet. We haven't got any training in place as an industry, and we've got to put all these procedures and expertise in place within our own organisations to deliver that. And I've already talked to some other businesses in the industry who believe that this is not for them. And I think ultimately this could stall the whole development process come October when this is brought in. And therefore, I think there is a big risk to project delivery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think Hannah has now joined us.
Yes, apologies for my late connection. I was having real challenges getting on this, so sorry I'm so late.
No, that's absolutely fine. That was actually perfect timing. I'm going to pass over to you, Hannah.
Fantastic. Well, then I will pop up my let me just work out how to share the screen for a second. There we go, that should be it. So let's find my presentation. There we go. Can you see my screen?
I can indeed.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, apologies for joining late. I'm hoping that I'm not going to be repeating what some other people have said, but we're going to go with it. And if it's been covered already, well, then it's duplicate, double, well-informed information. Let's think of it in that way. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Hannah Clark. I'm the Digital and Policy Manager at Construction Products Association. I'm also I sit on the Competence Steering Group, which is a combination of many bodies right across the industry that are looking at competence in response to the Dame Judith Hackett's review and to the changes in regulations that I will be talking about in a second. And I am also chair of WG12, which is one of the working groups that sit under the Competence Steering Group that has been looking at construction product competence, which I will also be speaking about in a bit. So I'm sure some of the other people presenting have already spoken about the Building Safety Act, but just in case they haven't, it is a fairly important piece of legislation that came into power last year. And I think there are some misnomers about the Building Safety Act. Lots of people think that this is specifically in relation to buildings in scope, that being residential buildings that are over 18 meters or 10 stories high. There is a part of the Building Safety Act which is giving a higher regime for those buildings, but actually the Building Safety Act overall is dealing with bringing in some really huge powers of oversight. It's going to bring in 2 regulators. That's the new National Regulator for Construction Products and the Building Safety Regulator under the HSE. Overall, I think for me, some of these big takeaways and what's I think very important for people within this webinar to understand is that penalties are now extended to unlimited fines and prison time. So gone are the days that if you deal with non-compliance, it's going to be a simple slap on the wrist. It's very much more a real penalty, which is coming in with these new regulations. When it comes to the definition of designer within the Building Safety Act, it's very similar to that of CDM, in that it extends to anybody who's dealing with anybody who making a choice around construction products is also now deemed a designer. So that, I think, opens up for many people some challenges in really understanding what is their level of competence. Do they have the appropriate competence to be able to fulfill the design responsibility and potentially design liability that comes along with those? And I think we're going to see a hell of a lot of unintentional designers. So, for example, that might be somebody in a merchants, for example, somebody comes in, says, I would like a product to do this. Somebody would say, you can use that one over there. That isn't something that should be happening, because that person probably won't have the level of information to make that decision. And do we have clarity over the level of competence they have to make that decision? There is a duty of competence on the entire supply chain. That's very important to understand. That is for anybody who's working on buildings. So there's duty holders, and the entire supply chain has to demonstrate their competence. And importantly, as part of that, organizations must demonstrate that the individuals in their workforce are not working beyond their competence. So you must be able to identify their competence and also demonstrate that they're not working outside that competence. And I think that's a real challenge, because at the moment, the HSE is working on the basis that the built environment sector is already doing the work, so we can already do these things. And I think there's enormous challenges for us to be able to actually move into a place where we can do those demonstrations, that we've got that infrastructure set up to be able to do that. Following the publish of the Hackett Review, and this is very much in joint work between the Competence Steering Group, between government, between BSI, we came together and we started producing, and many other stakeholders, of course. I don't want to suggest that's not the case. We sat down, we felt there was a necessity to have some more standards in place. The first one I want to point everybody to is BSX 670 version 3. This is currently in flex form. It's also currently it's going through the process of being turned into a full British standard. What this is looking at is setting core criteria for anybody who's creating any training or frameworks or any kind of qualifications, be that as part of an educational establishment, or it might be in-house training. What are the things that everybody needs to be thinking of? Because it's applicable to practically everybody working in the built environment, or everybody working on buildings, it's very much a checklist, a glorified checklist, if you will. So it's very much about looking through that. Is that requirement applicable to the things that we're doing here? If it's not, fine, we put that to one side. But if it is, we need to think about how we demonstrate it. So it's a framework for frameworks, if you will. It also covers in there behavioral competences, which are very key, because competence is defined in the regulations as skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors. It's very important we look at behaviors. We also have PAS 8671, 8672, 8673, which are looking at competences of the principal designer, principal contractor, and those dealing with the management of buildings. So within those, in fact, within all of these particular standards, we've got two things in common. We've got all of them say that you must be able to demonstrate the competence of those in your workforce, or the capacity of those in your workforce. And it also says that you must be competent with construction products. But for both of those requirements, it doesn't say how. And to this end, within the work that we've been doing at CPA, as part of the Competence Steering Group, we have published a white paper on proposed construction product competences, which are applicable right across the board. So that could be from anybody who's manufacturing, who's providing marketing information, technical support. It could be people who are designing with construction products, specifying, procuring. It could be anybody who's installing them, maintaining. Right across the gambit, there is applicability to identifying what your construction product competence is and what level of tasks you're able to perform according to your responsibility and accountabilities. So to do this, what we've looked at is understanding construction products and different levels of responsibilities and accountabilities. So at the very lowest core level, we have core level E, which is somebody who's responsible for performing tasks with and about construction products under supervision, responsible for relaying information about construction products without interpretation. Very important. Level E is an important level of competence, but key in this, there is no decision making that can be taken with it. In fact, decision taking with construction products doesn't come into play until level C. And even then, that's limited decisions that could be made. So this is really key with specification, because it's only when you have the competence of level C with a group of construction products that you can think about doing specifications, but that's only limited to within a direct scope of application. And when I'm talking direct scope of application, what I mean is that the manufacturer has identified what a construction product can do. If you are using it within those limits, all of the work has already been done to show that it can be used in a certain way. It's identified appropriate performances working within that system. So you need not quite so a large amount of competences to work within that direct scope. Then if you would work outside of that scope, what we call the extended scope of application, where you need to have much more understanding about what the construction product can potentially do, what risks changing, using it in a different method would be, how to mitigate those risks. So level B is when you can start using construction products in an extended scope of application. And level A is very much about final accountability. What are accountability for all the decisions, accountable for all the information, and also somebody who would be able to design rules about construction products, for example, design rules, substitution rules, product information rules, for example. I also thought it was worth taking people through the code for construction product information. I think it's very key to understanding what is necessary for appropriate specification. And I think good quality information is really important in that picture. So the code for construction product information, for those who don't know, is about ensuring that product information meets these 5 acid tests, and that is that information should be clear, accurate, it needs to be up to date, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to be unambiguous. To do that, the code looks at 11 clauses around 4 themes. So that's information creation, core information, additional information, and support and competence. So really it's about making sure that you've got all of the processes in place to make sure there's been full technical sign-off, to make sure that there's appropriate version control in place, that performances can be backed up by appropriate information, and that you've got all of the support that you need and clear warranties and guarantees, etc., in place. So it's quite a holistic code. It's available here. I won't go into it in much more detail because I have limited time. But really important, I think it's worth saying that this is run by CPI Limited. It's not manufacturers, it's third-party accountability, it's independent verification. You're independently verifying not the manufacturers, but you're verifying the products. That's really important. You can't just put a sticker on a manufacturer and say all of the products under us, they're all perfect. It goes by product lines. So you're looking at, does that product have that verification against it? So that's about it for me. I think that hopefully can just help facilitate some any further discussions when it comes to what challenges we're seeing with the Building Safety Act, what solutions are available for us while we try and deal with making sure that we've got the right things in place to be able to specify appropriately. And I'll stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Can I invite all the speakers to join us? We have quite a few questions that I'm hoping we can get through the last half of our session. Thank you, guys. I'm going to kick off with a kind of broad product-based question. Alongside the introduction of the Building Safety Act, and kind of in light of the wider issues of Brexit, supply chain issues, product scarcity, lack of testing facilities, what do you think the product sector needs to do to become fit for purpose?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry, just for a second. What does a product need to do to be fit for purpose?
What does the product sector need to do to become fit for purpose?
Ooh. That's a lot. We have to do
a loaded question, definitely.
We have to do a lot. You know, during this whole process of us, the entire built environment, looking at ourselves, there is work that needs to be done from every single sector, and of course, the product sector has a lot to do as well. So, as I did mention, the code for construction product information, that's going to be an enormous part of this. I think we need a space where the behaviours of product manufacturers is sincerely interrogated. And so hopefully the code for construction product information means that you're going to have unambiguous language. You can't have put out performances without showing appropriate information to substantiate those performances. So if we have that space where we've got some clear information, and also provide the industry with a central space for whistleblowing as well. If you are seeing somebody that's marked with a CCPI and you go, actually, they're not performing to that standard, you've got a space to go to CPI Limited, do that whistleblowing. That can be appropriately interrogated to make sure that, you know, there's some recourse there. So we've got that, and my hope is that people who purchase construction products will say, we want those ones. We want the ones which are properly verified. Then we've also got, for example, comparability of information. So we have lots of manufacturers that produce information in lots of different alternative ways. And really what that needs is standardization of information. We have things like under designated standards, we have performance. I don't think that that would provide the holistic information that you need to be able to make safe decisions. So we have another project separately, which is called the Lexicon Project. That is about bringing consensus to standardizing what construction product information, product data templates and product data sheets look like. That is a project that aims to agree what those structures look like, not just between manufacturers, but to invite the entire supply chain to be involved in that conversation. What is the information you need to see? What's the information you do not need to see? Once those structures agreed, then we can digitalize them. We can make those templates available to all the manufacturers. We can digitalize them. We can make it interoperable. And we can have our construction product information being laid out in exactly the same way according to what type it is. So that's really important. Then you've got testing information. That's a bit more of a challenge when it comes to manufacturers having an impact on how testing information is presented and how to make sure that that is clear, because actually there is testing houses are kind of separate to what our remit of governance has. I think that there is some work being done with the OPSS and DLUC, looking into what testing information looks like, looking into making sure that the appropriate standards are available to test against, to query those standards. That's certainly a piece of work that's being done. Paul Morrell has written a report for what product standard testing needs to look, what needs to be considered for that particular part of the picture. We're awaiting the publish of that report, and we hope that it's published sooner, because I'd be very fascinated to see what his independent review looks like. And as well, I think, as I said before, competence needs to be looked at. And that needs to be competence of manufacturers. It needs to be competence of everybody using construction products, because there's every point of the chain that can be thrown into problems. So I hope I've covered most of the sides of that answer.
I don't think Andrew and Adam have anything to add, do you? We've got quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to whiz through. If not, sorry, Adam.
I could add a little bit on that if you like, or we can wait for the next one. I know just Hannah raised a good point there about testing and the limitations of testing with specification of products. At the moment, a product will be tested to a certain standard. So say for a cavity barrier, for example, it's tested in a cutout in a concrete block or formwork. It's only tested in that one arrangement. When it actually then comes to site and you've got, say, modern methods of construction, SFS systems behind that cavity barrier and no longer a blockwork wall, not all manufacturers are having their products tested in the actual arrangement they'll be used in the real world. And they're looking for someone else, say the fire engineer, to say they'll put their name to it and they'll take liability for it, when they're not necessarily competent and experienced enough to do that, other than, say, someone in a test house that can do that kind of extended field of application assessment and say whether, yes, this product is tested in one way, but we actually believe it'll perform in the same way in a different form of construction. And there's a bit of a gap at the moment within who that responsibility falls to.
If I might come back on that, I think one of the challenges that manufacturers do face is that many of their construction products can be used in so many different combinations that they can only realistically identify certain fields for application. I think you're correct that there were potentially spaces for that. And I think what people who are using construction products need to be very aware of is what is the limits of that scope of direct application that we need to be aware of, and what are the necessary steps that have to be taken if you're using it outside of that direct scope of application, because it could be a lot more competence and a lot more cost if you're going to competently use them and get those tests in place. It would potentially have another test cost to appropriately use them outside that scope of application.
Thank you. We did have a question on, will the powers come into force for the National Regulator for Construction Projects, and will there be a scale of sanctions for non-compliance? I think, Hannah, you did touch upon this briefly.
So a scale of sanctions, I actually don't know what the sanctions look like when it comes to what the construction, regulator for construction products is bringing in. Sorry, what was the other side of the question?
So it was when will the powers come into force for the National Regulator for Construction Projects, sorry, and will there be a scale of sanctions for non-compliance?
I actually don't have in my mind a date for when the National Regulator for Construction Products is going to come into force. It's very challenging, that part of the conversation, because between Brexit and a number of other challenges, that is taking some time to kind of work out all of those pictures.
Yeah.
Potentially, there may be some different scale of sanctions, and I'm only thinking of that from the perspective we've got those different categories of construction products. You have products that sit under the new CPR, the New Construction Product Regulations UK. We have construction products that we consider safety critical, and essentially what that means is that construction products that don't already sit under the CPR regulations, but would naturally be part of systems that are critical to safety. So they would probably be on for similar requirements to would be required within the CPR, but it's not 100% clear what that looks like. And then the other ones are on the safety, product safety regulations which are already in place. I don't think I don't know if Andrew or Adam are aware of particular sanctions that have been identified when it comes to construction products.
Don't, I'm afraid.
No. It's BBC, I think. That one.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and find out. How is this? A question from Roland. How is competence likely to be recorded formally?
I mean, I can come in on the principal designer if I can. I mean, I think they'll be industry registered. So I think industry bodies and third parties will provide training, and you'll be undertake that training, and you'll be on an industry register as being a certified principal designer. I expect that will have to be renewed periodically every 3 years or whatever it will be. And therefore a client will go to that industry register to see whether Andrew Miller at PRP is on that register.
I think, having had conversations with DLARC and BSR about it, there are going to be a few ways of skinning a cat, and I think it will really change according to what the occupation or profession is. So, for example, there may be some particular professions that, you know, particularly those who are registered to chartered bodies, particularly in places where they're very intrinsic to the system working effectively, or like duty holding capacities where it may well be registers. For example, I know for fire risk assessors, it's a completely unregulated profession as it is right now. Anybody can say they're a fire risk assessor. There is a huge amount of work being done to regulate that system, to create standards, to kind of professionalize it, if you will. I think that's very much a direction of travel. But there are also types of professions and occupations where that isn't actually the best route. There's spaces where you would find it very difficult to register the various scales of competence that there are. And we must remember that it's not just the professionals that needs to be in the scale of competence. It is a whole scale of different people where their actions can contribute to a holistic system. So it's very dependent on what the profession, the occupation, the contribution, the risk, the responsibility, the accountability looks like as to what the mechanisms is. With construction product competence, we are making standards that could be made applicable to the industry, and the professions and occupations can take them and say, okay, in our part, we're going to demonstrate it in this way. we will leave it to those industries to choose what is the appropriate method of demonstration for them. We think that's the only applicable way you can do it when it comes to getting a whole industry to buy in to a similar standard.
And you mentioned chartership there, Hannah, as one way of doing that. Of course, in fire engineering, becoming chartered with institution of fire engineers is one way of showing your competence, but it's not perfect. You could get chartered in any aspect of, say, fire safety. It could be not related to the built environment, and then you're coming in and working on high-rise residential buildings that you may not have worked on before. So chartership is one bit, but we absolutely need to have that experience from that individual as well as the company, and there should be a way of recording that and making sure that everyone's competent for the actual role they're doing, not just generally being a chartered in some aspect of what they do. It should be specific for the task and job at hand.
Qualification is not competence according to these regulations. I think that's a really important point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We had one specific question from Tom. If a building has, for example, 8 dwellings over 5 to 6 floors, but is less than 18 metres, will the Building Safety Act apply?
So yeah, as if you're either over 18 metres or 6 stories or more, then yes, if you've got 2 dwellings in that building, it applies. If it's a single family house of that size, then no, the Act wouldn't apply, but it's very rare that you have single family dwellings of that size. So generally, yeah, residential building that comes into that category would fall under the Act. And as Hannah said before, that's for part of the Act, but all products and all buildings are covered by the Building Safety Regulator and the Act itself and the Products Regulator.
Yeah, it must be very clear. I cannot press that point enough. The competence requirements under the new regulations are for everybody contributing to all buildings, absolutely all of them,
How will these regulations affect historic buildings? We know they apply to historic buildings, but how will they affect historic buildings?
So I'm happy to jump in.
Talking to the retrofit as well. Sorry, go on, Adam.
So yeah, I was just going to say, we've got the gateway processes for new buildings, which we all probably know about quite well now, and so do the people listening in. But for existing buildings, there'll be a requirement to do a safety case on your building. So you assess the building, not just for fire safety, but for structural integrity, for the systems within that building performing a critical function as well. You'll have to document all that within a safety case report. And then you'll have to register your building with the Building Safety Regulator as well, and demonstrating, you will have to demonstrate that the risk is as low as reasonably practicable within that building. So it'll absolutely apply to existing buildings as well. And existing buildings is probably where you're going to have more of the issues. We've got the new regime coming in now. We all know what our duties are. Yes, we're still waiting on a bit of secondary legislation to firm everything up, but the whole industry now is aware of the importance of building safety going forward. It's assessing those existing buildings where it becomes challenging, and where we've got a lack of information as well. So there won't be as-built drawings from the time. The fire strategy, the building documentation, has probably been lost over the years. So there's going to be a degree of intrusive inspection on that existing building stock and then assessing it as well. And there's a lot of buildings to get through. And as I mentioned before, the industry is lacking on people that are experienced and competent. As Andrew also said about principal designers, if the amount of work there is out there, is there going to be enough people to look at the new buildings and the existing buildings at the same time? It's a lot of work to take on.
I think, Holly, if you're doing work to those existing historic buildings as well, and they're above the threshold, the height threshold, then the gateways kick in. But any building, as we've said, will require the principal designer and principal contractor on board as well, because they're duty holders, no matter the size.
Brilliant. Thank you. You touched briefly, Adam, on future regulation that we're waiting for. I think most industry professionals agree that some kind of prescription regulation is needed. But some argue that some of the clauses in the Building Safety Act still require clarification. What sort of secondary legislation and guidance do all of you hope to see in the future?
I think it'd be good to see an exact framework and methodology of what we should be doing. At the moment, I think just one aspect, so the digital golden thread of information and how we're going to record that. At the moment, it's been left to industry. Yes, there's a British standard out there, BS 8644, I believe, for doing that. But at the moment, it's kind of guidelines, and everyone's looking at different platforms and different ways of doing things. What I would like to avoid is a situation where client A, client B, contractor A, contractor B, whoever it is, principal designer. At the end of it, they present their pack of information. They hand it over to the client, the building owner, the building manager at the end of it. And they're getting completely different information from different people. It almost needs to be one system, one type of information that's handed over. So whoever receives it is able to readily understand it and use it. Whereas at the minute, industry is being left to its own devices in a way to develop that platform.
I think from me, Holly, it's a plea for the secondary legislation to come through as fast as possible, so the industry can prepare, because we simply don't know. We've got an understanding of what's coming, and we talked about the principal designer role, but you just can't start to prepare formally to provide that role or that service until we've got the secondary legislation through, or at least seen the final drafts of it. And then the next part would be guidance from HSE, from the building safety regulator. So they are publishing some guidance. There's a conference we were talking about today, which is, they're talking about the first stages, about registering your existing buildings, etc. But then we're going to need to know as an industry about the gateways and what the level of information is required at the gateways. And it's going to be uncharted waters for us all. We're going to be submitting things and testing the process and learning as we go. In probably 2 years' time, we'll all be used to it, and we won't need the guidance anymore, because we'll have been through the process and understand it properly.
If I could come back and challenge the idea of prescriptive regulations and the level of, yes, one way to do it all. Number one, I don't think you're going to see that, so you're going to be grasping at straws for that one. But number two, I actually don't think we do want that, even though it would seem like that would be the best way for us. Number one, the government does not have the competence, frankly, to put together the one perfect way to create buildings, the one perfect way to hand over information. And when we've seen them do prescriptive regulations, it's had enormous unintended consequences that are extremely difficult to be able to predict, and end up causing enormous issues, and not necessarily the right safety results, unfortunately. So it's really very important within this picture that we make sure that we are getting to a solution that has reapplicability. Now, I don't think you can walk down the street and see two buildings that look completely identical. It's not the way our industry works. The requirements are always different, the locations are always different, the audiences and what they're trying to do is already different, and the safety requirements may be completely different. So that's why the regulations are set out in target-based basis. We want to make sure that things don't burn. We want to make sure that they perform in certain ways. And I do not think that you're going to be seeing the regulators actually setting out precisely how we get to achieve those ends. They're setting us targets. They're not telling us how to achieve those targets. There are a lot of industry projects that are looking at what is the best way to achieve those ones. So, for example, if we were talking about the golden thread, I would suggest we look at the UK BIM framework, which are doing an immeasurable amount of work in that one. They're not going to set out precisely what is the best system to do that in, because it would be very challenging, given that there's so many different available types of projects that you're trying to serve.
Thank you. We have a great question from John. The advancement of the architect's role is a good thing, but will these increased responsibilities be reflected in the fees? Under design and build contracts, it's unlikely the lead consultant will have the status to implement, oversee these responsibilities. Will this see the return of the traditional contract?
I hope the answer is yes to that question. I fully believe we will see a more traditional contract. There might still be some design responsibility for contractors, but most contractors don't want the liability of specifying anymore and don't have the insurance to do it. I mean, one thing I didn't say about the PD role is that has to stay client side. It can't transfer over. So you've got a bit of an issue in terms of a designer taking on that role and then that designer being novated for the design to the contractor of the design and build, because the principal designer role for building regs has to stay client side. So either you have a Chinese wall within the organization and one part of the team goes off to work for the contractor. But I can see the fact that most of the design has to be done for Gateway 2. So the building virtually has to be fully designed for building regulation purposes for the vast majority of the buildings, unless they're the most complex. And you've got permission for the building safety regulator to do a phased approach. Will have to be fully designed before you go to Gateway 2. And the principal contractor, which could be the main contractor, will have to be on board much earlier as well. I can see that we're going to a more traditional route of design and procurement. And I think that's where the lawyers are sitting with it as well.
Sana asked, how do you envisage the design team relation and responsibilities between the building officer role and the building regulation principal designer will be compared to the current relationship between architect and building control officer?
I mean, the first thing to say, we've got to remember that for the high risk buildings above 18 meters, 7 stories and above, that building control officer will now be the building safety regulator. Okay. And there'll be a lead officer, and the building safety regulator will be liaising with, as we understand. It's a really good question. And there's obviously building control has been shaken up as well. Different titles, competency, national register, which has got to be legally in place by the 1st of October. And I think the more responsibility will be put onto the principal designer for building regs. But equally, I think they'll want to have a more stronger relationship with building control. You want a surety of what the design is that is going to pass the requirements. And I think that's particularly important with the building safety regulator, where I use the term uncharted water. None of us have worked with the building safety regulator. We don't know what their responses are going to be to our proposals, and we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Adam, did you want to add something? No. Perfect. We had a question. The time limit for claims for defective work and products used has dramatically increased, and with penalties for non-compliance now including unlimited fines and prison time, what impact does the panel think this will have on insurability and I guess the general appetite of the construction sector?
That is a great question, because I know that everybody is so challenged when it comes to insurance. I think that there is a lot of work to be done with insurers at the moment to make sure that we can align. I have concerns over. I understand why there is more oversight being brought over construction products that contribute to safety. I think that's appropriate. That makes a lot of sense. I don't think that the idea of the safety critical product, for example, is very well understood. I think people might misinterpret them as unsafe products as opposed to products that contribute to safety. I've heard anecdotes both from industry and insurers that they find those products, they don't know what's on the list, but they're concerned by them. And you would need to be able to use them to be able to have safe systems. So there is some dialogues in this place that we need to make sure that the messaging is really, really clear. We are going to have a space while people try and get up to these new levels of new requirements, new levels of competence, new levels of efficiency, where there is a space of trepidation. We're going to have to work really closely with insurers wherever possible to make sure that this works, doesn't cause more disruption within the community. That said, I've never had an insurer personally approach me before, and when we published the competence of construction products white paper, and I had three insurers knocking on the door saying that they would want to work with us to make sure that that messaging gets out. They think it's going to be really great. They think that it's going to reduce risk, and we dearly need to reduce risk in our industry. So I think in the long term, we are moving towards a space where we get back confidence. We get back confidence of insurers and government, public. The more we can work towards reducing these risks, the better we're going to get. I think that there is some serious questions to make that we are leveling our government to make sure that in this transition period that we don't have miscommunications that could have make more changes for industry when we're struggling to actually improve.
I think, Holly, just to come in very quickly, I know we're short of time, but on the building scale, so that was a product scale from Hannah. On the building scale, we think about the Defective Premises Act. You know, typically our appointments were 12 years liability. Now we're already changing to 15 years because of the looking forward effect of the Defective Premises Act. And that's affecting our record keeping as well. So obviously we've got to keep documentation longer. That adds to our costs. I've not seen any impact on professional indemnity insurance as a result of that 15 years. And I think, you know, most insurers are thinking that buildings are going to be better designed and better constructed, better quality than they ever have been because of all this new legislation that's coming in. And therefore the risks are much lower in terms of liability perspective.
Adam, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just on insurance, I think fire safety, fire engineering is a market that's had over the years has really tightened in terms of the insurance market. And as soon as a couple of years ago, there was kind of the smaller companies kind of dropping out of the industry because they couldn't afford the PI premiums for fire related claims. We also still see a lot of restrictions on insurance for fire safety, and there's some architects that can't get PI insurance to advise on fire safety. There's fire engineers that can't get PI insurance to advise on external walls because they have exclusions in that area. It does seem now that insurance market is untightening a little bit and insurance is becoming easier to find, but in terms of fire safety you still have things like aggregate limits on PI insurance rather than each and every that you'll get in some other areas, and it's just Andrew made the comment a bit earlier on about him needing his consultants to be back to back with him on his terms with his clients. In some cases with fire safety you just won't be able to get the same level of insurance cover as you will as say principal designer as architect. You won't be able to get the fire engineer to go back to back with you on that because they just don't have it in the market.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to have to call time. Thank you to everyone at home that sent in all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. If you'd like to download slides for today's session, you can access them by opening up the resources section, which is on the left of your screen. You should be able to download all our speaker slides. And yeah, please do join us this afternoon for our final risk and regs panel, which will focus on the golden thread of information. A huge thank you to all three of my speakers for today and to everyone that tuned in. I hope you have a lovely day.